Okay, so I'm live tonight with some lovely guests. I've got Dargesh, I've got Sonia, and I've got Fiera for a nice discussion about the US election. Now, unfortunately, one of our guests hasn't quite made it. I think there's been a bit of an issue with timing or time zones, but fear not. They might be along later. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to speak to Soul Bunny a little bit later on. However, the guests here so far are all fantastic, so I'm sure we'll have a fantastic discussion with them. How are we all today?
Doing well. How are you doing?
I'm
pretty good.
I'm doing the best I can, you know. Economy's shit, everything's shit. Feels like just everything's shit.
Yeah, I'm doing the best I can too. Teaching doesn't always pay as much.
It's a very noble profession, though, right? Like education's such a rewarding thing to get into.
You say that, and then you look at the parents around this area, and yeah.
Yeah, no, sadly, there's a lot of that, right? Like the benefits of education are not always appreciated by those who benefit from it.
Try teaching science in a very Republican area.
Oh, that sounds like a
Imagine that's
nightmare.
tough.
It gets
What
fun.
side, Sonia?
What?
What did you say? Sorry, I thought you.
I just said, oh, like I was just reacting.
It's a fitting reaction, right? Just the toughness of living in a system like that. I mean, we're lucky in the UK because, like, whilst we obviously have lots of conservatives, we don't have the separate distinctions between areas of the country that make such big gaps between various states, like you do in the US, right? Like, there's no chance of a conservative area just putting in their own awful version of education.
I'm always worried that people in the area here are going to be voting for things like putting religions in schools, like in Oklahoma and all that shit.
It's
Would
scary.
you actually be forced to teach that then?
Oh, I will flat out refuse, and if they try to fire me, I will simply get the union, and it's like, no, this isn't going to pass. And if they fire me, well, I would rather be fired than have to teach religion.
So are you in Oklahoma then, Dargesh?
What?
Are you in that state? Are you in?
No, I'm in Ohio. But
Okay.
I could see it happening here. Like, luckily, it's a little bit not as Republican, but the area I'm in very much could.
Yeah. It's scary, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's so... I mean, when I read that story from Oklahoma, where they've literally just put their own sort of Republican right-wing version of religion straight into public schools.
Yeah.
State schools, it's terrifying. It's so... Just, like, looking at that happen, you feel so bad for the children that have to grow up in a system that's basically been catered to for the most, visceral, violent conservatives you can imagine, which I think sort of fits a nice place to start, really, with how we're feeling about this onset of a potential Republican victory, right? A potential right-wing ascendancy with this election.
I mean, Kamala's definitely acting like she's owed this, like in a very Hillary fashion.
Yeah,
like,
I'm getting
the past few weeks she has, like, I think it's when she imported like Labor Party advisors into her campaign, because since then she's been going hard into the bipartisanship and ignoring the winning, like, rhetoric she had of calling Republicans weird and crazy. Because like when you do that, people are like, yeah, they are. It's like, but then she doesn't do that anymore, and she also has like not done anything about Palestine or anything, because like much of the electorate is upset about it, and she just does not care.
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like the Labour Party, who benefited massively from the collapse of the Conservative Party's vote in the UK, and yet treat themselves as though they've got this divine right to power. They've got a massive. They treat their parliamentary power as though it's the same as voter support and electoral success. And then when they head over to the States and send some of their people over to advise Kamala, there's that worry that their arrogance is going to sort of translate over. And like you say, there is that concern that actually the election is not potentially going to go the way of the Democrats, and the Trump fascist machine is going to just sweep and get their way.
You think they would have learned from Hillary?
That's the thing, right? Like it's the at the core of the Democrat Party are a lot of people who essentially haven't really adapted to the rising far right and the way the world is. Like there's a really interest at the end of history by Francis Fukuyama, and the idea that the sort of liberal capitalist organization of society is the ultimate fix for society, and the way things are sort of designed and meant to be, and that all the problems of life will fix themselves within this system. But that's not quite the same as when we analyze it alongside real society we live in. And so the dissonance between how they feel the system should react and how the system does react to legitimate problems leaves big gaps between the average person's like existence and the mechanisms of the Democrat Party. So even as the fascist element of Republicans like comes to the forefront, and even as the Democrats, still represent a better governing body than Republicans, the gap here alienates people in a way that leaves them vulnerable in an election like this. And I think it is quite scary that they're potentially going to walk into another 2016 situation and lose an election.
Yeah.
And the annoying thing is it has an effect on the rest of the world because, I mean, America, you get Trump in, Trump's talking about basically saying fuck you to NATO, which lets Russia start doing a lot more bullshit. Not that Russia could win anything much, but if the US loses, it's just
that's the thing, isn't it? Like I sort of my concern as well for this particular election is the current situation the world is in, right? The climate crisis, the fear. Hello, Sonia. The fear of the destabilizing sort of political order, the rise of conflict, the genocide in Palestine and the Middle East, and the fact that the keys to one of the world's most prominent economies, the world's most militant nation on the planet, are being handed to the fascists, the Republicans who do not care for civil liberties and rights, who want to essentially forward a fascist view, a ultra-conservative, ultra-right-wing view of society onto the globe. And yet, at the same time, you have a Democrat Party who are complicit in much of these ongoing crises, right? Because they still, as we've seen with Biden, they're still happy to shake hands with Israel and shake hands with the people committing the genocide. They're happy to engage in climate negative policies. Obviously, bombing a country is not good for the planet. Supporting the various corporations in their ongoing non-renewable energy sources isn't good for the planet. They're happy to maintain a right-wing stance or right-wing rhetoric on like immigration and on many other civil liberties when they see fit. And so, in some ways, the party, as with any party in a capitalist system, has to stick to this like right-wing path because they're operating within the system, and the system is continually being dragged further and further to the right.
Yeah, and they don't want to put any pushback. They want to pretend it's not going to the right.
They are insistent that they don't need to change, but also they need to drift further right to pull more moderate Republican voters in. It's also this obsession with the fact that, or I've been obsessed with the fact that at this point it feels like a lot of people feel there's no difference between the two parties, and while there are some differences, I'm starting to feel like every time it's the Democrats in power, they just cave to every Republican agenda anyways. So it's like, at this point, why are we even bothering?
Yeah.
It's that fear, right? Like I think, like you say, right, there's for the average person living in late stage capitalism, the sort of pulls, even though like it's better to be less right wing, and so the Democrats being less right wing produce healthier places to live than the more right wing states. It's like picking between various unappetizing plates of food, right? Like either way, you're eating a terrible dish, and whilst one has literal poison in it, it's hard to convince. It's hard to convince people who are so disenfranchised, often literally disenfranchised, right? Because a lot of places that are voting are not being run fairly. There's that trouble in getting people motivated in a system that is utterly demotivating, right?
Yeah, I've seen it like written about as like you have 100% Hitler and then you have 90% Hitler. Because that's essentially the position we're in.
Yeah.
The entire campaign is now just revolving around a small group of Pennsylvania voters at this point.
Which is another huge problem with your electoral system, right? You haven't got a system in which people's votes directly translate to who will be in charge. You have a system where certain states have massively weighted the system, or massively hinge the election on themselves to determine the fate of the election, which denies the potential for real organic change through that system, because ultimately you're going to be stuck with those two domineering parties, which I think I'm a big believer in pragmatism. Like I'm saying all these things, and I'm hoping that the Trump campaign loses and the Republicans are kept out of power. But it's very much I don't want Trump to win than it is I'm a big supporter of Kamala Harris and the Democrat Party, right? Because I believe that the consequences for the globe and for Americans and for anyone on the planet really are much more dire if that Republican Party wins. But at the same time, I can sit and say, actually, the Democrat Party are not some solution. There's not going to be like a miracle if Harris is able to win this election. So to me, that's one of the reasons I sort of like these discussions, because I feel so conflicted about where I how I should feel going forward from here.
Personally, I think we have if Harris wins, we have about 4 years till Civil War. If Trump wins, or 3 years till Civil War. If Trump wins, we have like a year. Because I'm being honest with like the rampant fascist tendencies amongst the far right, or the entire Republican Party as it is. It's like all their moderate Republicans are Democrats at this point. That's just what it is. Like, she's not targeting like anything. And there's going to be, if she wins, there's going to be another January 6th. They're already talking about it. But I think it's going to be random acts of terror, regardless, with either victory for like a year or two, and then shit breaks out. And it's not something you want to happen, but it is very likely.
Yeah, like this undercurrent of far right terror, of far right violence. I mean, you see with the bubbling right-wing media, right? They're happy to not only accept Trump's narrative, but basically support the idea that actually elections are things to be decided, spoken about as though they're opinions and not like a tangible fact. You've got accounts like I forget his name now, but the one who like tweets out random photos of suspected LGBTQ people and like basically encourages domestic bombings and stuff.
Oh, lives of TikTok.
Yeah, there you are. That's it. And accounts like that. That, as you say, there's far right activity through like militias and through groups like that. There's absolutely that threat there, right? But then that's part of the wider ecosystem across the world of capitalist decay, right? Like the struggles of an economy based around right-wing ideals will inevitably devolve into far-right ideals when said capital cannot be sustained, right? We saw this in Nazi Germany when the capitalists backed the Nazi party and put their resources into destroying marginalized people and rising sort of far-left organizations and movements. You could argue that the reaction to civil rights movement and social gains and stuff in the 60s and 70s came in the form of Reagan and Thatcher, and the transformation of social states and social democracy into neoliberalism, and the shifting of supposedly left-leaning parties into basically like conservative light parties, as we saw with Labour in the UK, Democrats in the US, plenty of parties across France, Germany, etc. So to some degree, you do have that that general concern, right? That this isn't just a US thing. I mean, look, you have to look in London, in my country today, where far right instigators basically encouraged a far right rally in the city centre, in the capital. And obviously in the summer we had quite a few far right riots that actively tried to target and murder immigrants. So I think whilst it is easy to be not easy, whilst it is sad that this is likely in America, this is something I think that is a threat for as long as we have a system that's in terminal stages like our current capitalist system, where ultimately democracy is being eroded, our ecology is we're basically plowing into a climate disaster, it's ongoing. There's so many things happening in the world. So I think this is one thing that is going to be sadly a bit inevitable just anywhere at this stage.
Yeah, I think what's most important is that you find places to organize with, because in the coming years they will be important to have those networks.
Yeah, no, exactly. Organization is so important. Like being able, be it like physical training, just keeping fit, being in the community, connecting to people around you, joining unions, making sure you're connected. Your labor is something you're organizing with other people. These are all things which are going to make it harder for right-wing forces to act upon you, right? Be it, and that's even if Harris wins and the Republican Party, even in the ideal scenario where all the criminal acts that party is doing are somehow addressed, and Elon Musk loses all his government contracts and gets put in court for all the things he's done, and Trump is sent to court as well for all his things. And if all that happens, it's still valuable to engage in actions which benefit the community and benefit yourself through the connections to others. At the same time, though, I do think it is important to remember that for as frustrating as the sort of liberal organization of society is, it's not at the stage where things are going to just collapse like a house of cards, right? I think there is still time before a potential repeat of January the 6th and a potential a Nigel Farage prime minister premiership. There's still time to to act and to do things that can make it easier. And I think that's one of the really frustrating things about the Democrat Party, is that they could quite easily do a few things now that could massively help them in the long term. If we take this election cycle, for instance, Elon Musk and his ownership of Twitter is quite actively, as has literally been found in the case of his current organization with the Republican Party, to be engineering the election for Trump, right? Misinformation, targeting various voter blocks, spending money that they really shouldn't be spending. All of these things are happening right now by his organization. There are some things that can be done quite quickly to stop that. And regardless of what right-wing media types sort of cry about, it's well within justification to do those things. And so that would go quite some way to taking away some of the organizational power that lots of these right-wing groups have, because let's not forget, part of the reason Trump, the right-wing people converged on Twitter was to make it easier for them to organize their movements and easier to concentrate power and concentrate visibility. Take some of that away, and suddenly they feel less emboldened, less powerful. Suddenly they're more isolated and less able to coordinate said acts of terror and said hate campaigns.
I saw something from some random geek in chat, which I think is prescient. You should plan on what you're doing for if Trump wins and still do it regardless if he doesn't.
Yeah. No, exactly, right? It's so important to look at the election, but also look beyond the election. It's important to, as you said a moment ago, Sonia, there's a lot of bad things that could potentially happen despite a Harris victory or because of a Trump victory. And so it's very important to ensure that we're not treating this as though it's a game of a sport, like a World Cup game where one team wins and now it's over until next time. It's got to be a continual moving thing. I think it's also important to remember that not all resistance has to be I feel like sometimes when we talk about getting ready, it doesn't necessarily have to be fighting and like, you know, learning how to shoot off guns and stuff. It could just be as simple as, you know, collectively organizing with your neighbors and your people around you. It could just be sharing resources and you know, helping out at a local food bank or a local charity drive, and ensuring that the people in your community know who you are and you know who they are, so that in times of strife and difficulty, things are easier to, you know, to pull together. There's a lot of things that look very bleak because of the way our society is at the moment, but what remains consistent is that humans are there for each other, right? We're social animals. We're able to exist socially, and so there is still hope whilst we're able to share language and culture and ideas. And it is tricky, but I'm an optimist as well as being pragmatic and realist and all of that. I do believe that there is still hope, even in darker moments, like potentially on the horizon.
Yeah, one thing you can do, and I would recommend doing if you live in an apartment, talk to your neighbors, organize a tenant union, figure out how like you can, you know, consolidate a collective bargaining on rent or something. Genuinely, anything you can do to get your community on your side is something that is very important. Like convincing your neighbors in your apartment complex to organize a tenant union. That's something very prescient, because if you can hold your landlord to a collective bargaining agreement, then it's something you can, you know, try to, if you can get everyone on board, then you can withhold rent for a time to force rents to go down.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, there's never the power of people together, so never to be underestimated. Yeah. I think as well, there's it's interesting because there's the pragmatic sort of in-person things we can do, but at the same time as that, I do also think there is, whilst we have the system around us, there are things that should be done perhaps more to be able to try and work the system to our advantage too. Because whilst for as much as the Democrats deserve our criticism, I think it is worth also pointing out that in places that have had tight elections that the Democrats have won in, there have been lots of very important victories. I think certainly reproductive rights is a big one. It's quite stark, the difference between how they currently exist in states that go blue versus states that go red. LGBTQ rights is another one I think is quite important. Voter rights, lots of little differences that, whilst obviously not perfect under Democrats, are light years ahead of anything the red states offer. And so I think, whilst I'm not saying, you know, fly a flag for any Democrat and be, you know, pro like blue all the way, it is worth still hammering home a point that it's easier to exist when you prevent Republicans from winning. I think uniting against a common threat is still something that has, especially when a threat is so visceral like a fascist, there is something that can be pointed out there, unified there, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to say something, Dargesh.
Yeah, the thing I would say too is, like, in the national election, I'm going to be voting Democrat because of what they're doing. But like locally, that's where we need to start voting who we want in, because we need to focus on harm reduction on a national level, but we need to, on a local level, see about getting people where we need the change we want to see. That's where we need to get the fighting going.
Exactly, right. And I think part of that also is, as not to like be too ageist, but like as time moves on and there is this discontent in society, that can be seized upon, right? If there's enough people who say, actually, we need change and we're going to actually act upon that change, that can deliver things, as we saw generations ago, that transform the outlook of society. Because I know it's a bit cliche to say, could you imagine saying to a black person 100 years ago, you'll have the votes and you'll be equal in the eyes of the law? But at the same time, it's true, right? Can you imagine saying to an American of 100 years ago, you know, how many things would be gained by left-wing worker movements in the time since then? And so electoral change is something which is tangible and possible. It's whether or not it's achieved. It's not an impossibility just because a bad system's been in place for a long time, as with any bad thing. So there are always victories worth trying to fight for. And yeah, electoral reform, prisoners' rights, anti-disenfranchisement. These are all things that would massively minimize the damage that can be done electorally. But as you say, Dargesh, like local organization, local campaigns, and collective activity are so important for actually trying to get things moving on a small level, which can roll a ball towards a bigger eventual change.
Yeah, because I don't have any love for the Democratic Party, but I know that they're the better one of the two. So we need to at least harm reduce while working on getting the change we need. And doing a protest vote just makes it worse.
Well, indeed, right? Like in a third part. Sorry, we're going to say something.
I mean, I have a couple of things to say. So taking over the local thing, that's local levels. That's what the Republicans had done for the past, 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
So if we can turn it around, that would be preferable. But that's such a slow process that I don't think it's the only thing we can rely on. Another thing is, if you live in a solidly blue state or a solidly red state, it doesn't matter if you have a protest vote or not, because your state is not significant to, the election.
Yeah, but I will say too, the advantage of not protest voting too, at least putting your name on something, means you can at least argue, well, look at even though I know that the actual numbers don't matter because our stupid system's bullshit with the electoral college, at least it shows the number of people voting one way and we can be like, look, fuck you, you're not popular even though you won.
I think with first past the post, it's very tricky because you have a system which essentially is just bad, right? Like it's undemocratic. It doesn't allow for things to properly change. It's readily, especially when you combine it with the capitalist mechanisms on top of it, it undermines the way democracy is able to work and stops real change happening. However, as you said, Sonia, I think wedding the 2 points together, there's no harm in being able to look beyond the actual election act. Like you can organize and protest and be vocal and still act and still vote in an election to reduce the harm and to stop the Republican Party from doing more damage. I think it's possible to simultaneously, in a deeply blue state, right? Like California, say, you can despise someone like Gavin Newsom and his anti-homeless policies and still recognize that the parts of California which have more Republicans in are much, much worse to live in, and have schools which get really conservative policies put in place and can be really dangerous for marginalized people, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I do think though, I live in a solidly blue state on the East Coast. I'm not gonna vote for president this election because I can't justify to myself voting for Kamala Harris when she's still committing genocide and involved in committing genocide in Gaza. So if I can just, it doesn't matter if I vote for her or not because Maryland's going to her regardless.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose. Oh, so was someone else going to say something? Did I just cut someone off? Was that someone's audio?
I wasn't about to say anything.
Okay. Well, I suppose, of course, on an individual level, potentially one vote doesn't matter. But I do think there is maybe just because of how I've always felt about it and stuff. I do think that there is still some importance in the democratic process of voting, which ultimately people did, and that's not like oh, you're evil and bad if you don't vote. I mean, for me personally, because of the history of how long it took to actually get rights for people to vote, there is still some weight and merit, even in deeply safe seats, in voting as such, right? And so to me, even if I always use a sporting metaphor here, though the 10th goal in a 10-0 win did not really change the nature of the game, it still adds on to the goal difference. It still goes on to the stats of the league, and ultimately it still helped consolidate the victory, even if only in a small way. And so for me, even just the act of engaging in democratic vote is still important, even in our skewered, bad capitalist democracy that we sort of have to exist in at the moment, right?
Well, I'm not ignoring the rest of the election. I'm just not voting for president specifically because there's an important Senate race in my state. There's an important there's important local races I have to be keeping track of, but I just can't bring myself to vote for Kamala Harris.
Yeah. And is that like as a sort of her previous positions, or like is that like
her active
disdain
participation in genocide?
Exactly right, like the ongoing disgust in the situations there. Like I firmly believe that needs to be at the center of like all sort of discussion, right? Like the fact that in 2024, with so much information and communication, that this disgrace was able to go forward at the heart of so much of America. But for me, that is all of American history, right? Like from the very start of the nation's conception, you had the erasure of indigenous populations, the enslavement of Black people, the disenfranchisement of millions, the numerous interventions across the world, the globe over in the name of American capitalism, the ongoing oppression of people to this day in red and blue states. And so to me, whilst of course all of this is so important to bring up at every point, right? It's unremovable from American history. To make that this election's sort of talking point is, and not the same for every other point, feels a little like I don't know. It's to me the weight of this moment is quite big, like, and because of the health of the planet and the current state of the far right and the way that these moments can embolden them massively. There is something about this electoral process that I think swerving this election because of like a moment isn't necessarily the healthiest sort of decision, if that makes sense. And that's not as like a oh, it's only you're doing the wrong thing or anything. Like to me, absolutely, people involved in the Democrat Party who are contacting Israel and are basically like downplaying an active genocide need to be in court and facing tribunals and intervention basically for arming states' erasure of the Palestinian people and other peoples around the Middle East. However, at the same time, like this is true of American capitalism at large. Like the whole system is set up on these exploitative principles, be it exploiting workers in the Congo for their rare metals to make phones and computers, be it the exploitation of the rainforest to for farmland to create meat and stuff. Like there's so many awful things happening in the world right now, but the electoral system, as broken and as awful as it is still something that serves as a mean for the far right to obtain power. And for me, every single moment that we can deny them a bit of power is one worth taking, even if it means having to engage in a system which we know to be fundamentally flawed, right?
I will also say I think that the local elections are the more important of them because while the presidential one is very important, I would agree that one person in the sea of how many will be less impactful than it will in a local election.
I think they're all... Sorry, go ahead, Sonia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's... I wanted to address a comment I saw in the chat because Atomic Crouton had said, I will absolutely challenge people on not voting. We have genocide taking place in our own borders, but your excuse for not voting is ignoring what's here to posture about something overseas. I completely disagree. It is also my stance on the anti-Latino genocide and the immigration system in America that has not changed under the Biden-Harris administration, that has actually gotten worse under the Biden-Harris administration. So it is actually my specific take that regardless of like whether or not I in my blue state vote for, I'm not saying not to vote for president if you live in a swing state. That's an important thing to decide the outcome of the election. But I personally do not have to vote for Kamala Harris because of the place I live in and the fact that all the electoral votes are going to her anyways. So I will not. It is not just posturing. It is a moral dilemma that I cannot like move past. And to call it posturing feels very insulting to me as someone who has been arrested in activism for Palestine and been like harmed and attacked by police. I really find that honestly disingenuous and quite callous, because calling it posturing is very insulting to me.
I think that's the thing, right? Like, there's one of the massive criticisms that is important to hold of the Democrat Party is their engagement in many right-wing and often identical beliefs that the Republican Party and the conservatives have, right? For as much as many Democrats in the higher ups of the party would love to sort of use the Republican Party as like a reason to vote, justify voting for Democrats, there is that policing of protest, the essentially, as you say, identical essentially the cruel process for which immigrants are treated in America, the ongoing genocide in the Middle East, and they are reasons for which the Democrat Party have to be held accountable for, be it today, tomorrow, a year's time, a decade's time, like however long it takes. There needs to be action taken for the injustices of the world. I think the issue, like the problem, I think that arises is that in the here and now, whilst we're living in a world that these people ultimately are the people in power or people who are the option we have, there's unfortunately a need to interact with that, right? And so, I know it's a state like Maryland is very, very likely to be Democrat, right? Almost a certainty, almost taken for a given. But every vote does count, and like for as much as I again, this isn't me saying you need to vote Sonia. Absolutely not. It's your decision. My own personal thinking, like, is it? I'm not fortunate enough to. Obviously, I'm not in America, but I don't live in a constituency which is firmly one way or the other. It swings. It changed from Conservative to Labour recently. However, like because of that, I'm sort of a bit reticent to the idea that votes don't hold. Like, obviously, we know they don't mathematically have the same equal weight because of the nature of the Electoral College, but to me, there is still an importance in a vote, even if it is one of thousands that confirm the win for a particular party. In terms of like posturing as such, I think that yes, it is. I do wish Atomic Cruton hadn't used that particular word, because absolutely, people who criticize the Democrat Party often come from a very solid like grounding, right? I think because of the nature of this election, because of the stakes of a potential Trump victory, there is that incense that I think a lot of people feel about criticisms to the Democrat Party, especially if you live in America or really any country at this point. Like, the amount of toxic and negative and outright lies that get written about things make it very hard to sometimes see a legitimate criticism and think, oh yes, this has been made in good faith. This is a genuine discussion about the health of the country, and not just like a Fox News scare piece, right? Like when you scroll along your social media and you see like hurricane machine aimed at North Carolina, or Kamala Harris secretly, I don't know even what, or Tim Walz is secretly like in league with P. Diddy and all that sort of stuff, right? Like there's so many disingenuous, so much rubbish that when someone has a legitimate point, like you have, Sonia, that is a criticism of a party which is complicit in many bad things, it can sometimes be interpreted the same way, right? So it's tricky to be able to navigate in this, especially when especially when the far right are so close to a really damaging victory. I think there is genuine concern, and so there is worry that people with the feelings you do exist in these states where every vote does count, and vote elections are a matter of a few hundred votes either way, potentially.
Sonia, if I may ask a couple of questions here based on my understanding of what you've said. Your choice to not vote on a president could potentially be translated into not caring about which president it is that wins. Is that something that you disagree with?
Yes, I
Please
do.
Explain.
My choice to not vote for president is not because I do not care which president wins, which candidate wins. It is because I think that in a lot of ways not many things will change. In a lot of ways, things will change with the Trump administration, but in a lot of ways, the Harris administration would probably follow suit if the Republicans pressured them to do so. It's the fact that, like, I would prefer Harris to win, but I am not going to put down the vote with my name to it because I cannot justify doing that. I have a preference for who would win, but it's still, 90% Hitler versus 100% Hitler. It's like,
Fair. And you had said that casting this vote, I think you had said either a moral or ethic issue for you personally. And the comparison for Hitler, and this brings up the second question that I had wanted to ask you. The victims of the genocides, the Palestinians, or, any of the Jews that were murdered by Hitler, if they had the ability to vote in an election the way that you have the ability to vote in this election, how would they be choosing to use their power?
Voting for the American president or voting in an election generally? Because during Hitler's time, many Jews did vote for the other parties that were not Hitler. And guess what? Didn't change
Palestinians,
anything.
if Palestinians could vote in this current election, if they had that power, would they be using it to vote, or would they also abstain because they feel like it won't make enough of a difference which one wins?
Would the Palestinians be voting in the American election?
I'm saying if they had that ability, which one would they be choosing? Because right now I want to use my voice in place of theirs because they don't have a voice in this election, but this election affects them.
Well, currently, we're in the Biden-Harris administration, and the genocide is still ongoing. So,
yes.
And they pay lip service to trying to stop it, but every time they say they're trying to stop it, it's like, oh, we can't control Israel, even though we can completely control Israel.
Absolutely, but this still feels a bit like a dodge. How do you think that the victims of this genocide would vote?
I don't think they would. I don't think it would make that much of a difference because both presidential candidates are undyingly loyal to Israel.
Okay, thank you.
On that point, and I think someone Crucial makes a comment about it. I mean, and Geeks well, actually, there's a little bit of a the 90%, 100% Hitler thing. I think is interesting because absolutely the victims of people who are bombed by missiles and weapons that have been manufactured in America, sent to Israel, and then dispatched against Palestinians. Like, it doesn't matter which party is bombing you. If you're bombed, right, you're going to be dead. And as I said a moment ago, there needs to be justice in the sense of Democrats responsible for these deals need to be sent off to The Hague and interrogated for like what went on, and ultimately found guilty. My frustration, I think, with some of the discussions around this comes from what I mentioned earlier, the wider, you say yourself, right, America is an ally of Israel, and so for generations has been a friend and ally to a nation that has many, many people with a far-right fundamentalist religious view like President Netanyahu, right, who uses his control of Israel to enact genocide.
Netanyahu isn't religious, but
well, like in the sense that, like in the same way that the Nazis,
he's an ethno-nationalist.
Yeah, exactly, right. But in the same way
fascist,
that, no, 100%, like a far right fascist uses religion as a means to power, doesn't necessarily like they don't. It's in the same way that like the Nazis believed in the superiority of Christian white society, right? Like it's not like a belief based on theology as a proper thing. It's like a symbol for which they gain power. Yeah. But what I think Fiera's point and some of the points in the comments is that the administration, whilst not being useful in this moment and being complicit, is still less dangerous than a Trump administration, which actively wants to further what is happening at the moment and has an even more like dystopian view of what they want to happen to the Middle East in general. And whilst, of course, this is not enough, and of course there needs to be action taken, this election exists in a range of ecosystems that all need to be addressed. And as such, because of the, what I'm trying to say is that there is a possibility of things changing under the Democrat. Like if a Democrat is president, there is more scope for ending the genocide, that like a greater chance for like probability wise than under a Republican president. That's ultimately like it's a mathematical thing. Like we have more chance of being able to do the things which can stop the genocide than if Trump wins.
I mean, yes, but I don't see the need to harm myself in terms of my ethics and morality to vote in a blue state that is guaranteed going to Harris. Because not everyone in my state believes the way I do. Most of the people in my state are centrist liberals who would vote for Harris regardless. So I don't see the need to vote for Harris because my vote doesn't matter. My presidential vote does not matter. You can tell me all you want that it matters. Statistically, it does not matter.
Matters less certainly than, or is less statistically weighted than in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, but still does it like as I said earlier, right? The person who scored the first goal in that football game scored a more important goal than the person who scored the 10th goal, but the 10th goal is still 10% of a win, right? Like I know that's a slightly crude metaphor or analogy or whatever, but like I do firmly believe that there is still a power in voting, and I'm not, I'm not like saying here that you've done something ethically wrong or anything. My point is more that for as bleak and as undemocratic as your system is, there is still value as such in trying to use one mechanism as a way of doing it. But in the sense of like voting itself, I think that as Fiera sort of hinted at a moment ago, this election does have repercussions across the world. And I think certainly the way, like for me, a British person sort of looking over, we have just seen Labour government win and sit in their hands a little bit, and not particularly, like in some cases, actively posture towards quite right-wing ideas. There's lots of concern that there's several people in the Labour Party at the moment who are quite transphobic and quite anti-LGBTQ. Keir Starmer is currently like farting around with, we don't need to give reparations back, and quite conservative ideas about the British Empire. Having said that, though, the far right in our country, which is increasingly tying itself to Trump, which increasingly wants to make a name for itself, which Nigel Farage, obviously leading its Reform Party, they would be massively emboldened, as with many, many far-right organizations across the world and far-right leaders, by a Trump victory. And so, to me, everything we can do to fight against that potential victory is something worth doing. And that's not to, again, like I feel as though you're 99.999% right that your vote would not matter in Maryland, right? However, to me, like if I was in Maryland and in the same sort of situation, right, I'd be in the same place, right? Like we as people who are not Republicans are unlikely to see Republicans win in deeply blue states. But I still, to me, there's just something about not using every vote I could. Like I always vote in every anything I can, just because for me, it's something people have fought for and died for, And maybe that's just who I am. Maybe that's just that's not me trying to be like morally superior or like trying to say that you're bad and wrong and stuff. But there's just something I don't know. It's just like you've got the chance to vote, and that wasn't always there for everyone.
I'm not saying that generally people should not vote in the presidential election. I think if your vote would have any kind of impact, then you should vote. I'm considering writing in a candidate that is like has no chance of winning, because you say you're not trying to morally shame me or something, but it really feels that way to me, because every time you constantly bring up like your personal responsibility to vote and things like that it was something fought for. It's also, though, that I from how I see in trends of this country, I do not think it will matter. I think we're going to a civil war regardless.
And I get that as like like the health of the British system's not in much better state either, right? And it's like I think that we know that the health of global capitalism is not good, right? Like be it the decay of liberal democracy, the ongoing warfare in numerous regions of the world, the global climate catastrophe. Like there are huge problems facing humanity, and that is true whether Trump or Harris wins. To me, and it is a little bit mathematical, and it is a bit like of a sports type thing to some degree, but just giving ourselves slightly better odds to be able to fix things, like slightly, just like even turning that dial a little bit back, like to me that is still worth something. Like, and I feel like we're hinging this on like you specifically voting. Like, of course, I want to sort of like move away from that as like a particular thing. I'm more talking about in general, because like there's a lot of people who have the same feelings that you do, but in more critical areas. And you said earlier that people in swing states want to vote for presidents and stuff. My concern, because ultimately the election is a mechanism for which we engage with government, and it's a bad one, right? Because it's not democratic, it's not fair, it isn't a healthy way to have currently. Just once every 4 years we come together and do this thing, and then it's actually once every 5 years in the UK, because of they changed the mandatory amount of time you can have between elections, so now you can have 5 years before you have to vote again. So like you don't, there's no that you won't need to convince, like me at least, of the fact that liberal capitalism is not a sustainable way to run a country, run a planet, and that eventually that tends into fascism. But liberal capitalism is still like something I would vote for over like the outright fascism of the far right, even as they lurch into the right. And that doesn't contradict the action we can take in between those elections to push against both fascism and the arrogance of a liberal right-wing system. Geek says in the chat, I didn't vote for Harris either. I live in Washington State. Obviously, that's a similar situation, right? Where Seattle's Washington State.
I mean, Seattle's pretty much all the votes for Washington State. If we're honest, because the Seattle metropolitan area is like the majority of the population.
Yeah, like I'm not like, obviously your assessment of the situation is not incorrect. Like one vote not being cast for Harris in that election is very, very unlikely to, like, you're not going to wake up and then see the election has been swung on, like Maryland's gone red on one vote. But at the same time, I like it's still a democratic process, right? And I think that's just what, I don't know how you two feel, Dargesh and Fiera, but like it's, for me at least, like I will always vote in any election that I have the opportunity to, like just as a way of engaging with something.
I do have more clarifying questions, if you don't mind. Does a 90% of a Hitler mean that 10% of the victims would be saved?
No, because literally the part that is Hitler is the enabling of genocide domestically and foreign. the 10% is that they're in lip service, not harmful to minorities. However, that is being ratcheted back on with the current Senate race in Texas running on the fact that the Democrat is running on being against trans students in sports and stuff like that. It's very much that the Democratic Party is swinging right, and I don't see why in elections where my vote doesn't matter. I'm voting for Senate. I'm voting for all these other things. I don't see what the difference in these two candidates is for my vote, because the one candidate is going to win my state regardless. I have no reason to you say 10% as in the 10% of the victims who will be saved, but the fact is the 90% is still too much. And it's having to put that together is why am I making myself vote for someone who is going to kill, in that metaphor, 90% of the Palestinian population?
One thing I will say too, though, is my spouse is trans, and I fear the Republicans getting in charge, because I'm afraid that if they get in charge, a lot of what they've been saying is going to really severely hurt people here. So, while I don't want the genocide to continue, but I also acknowledge that if we if we take the stance of, well, it's 90% Hitler, well, the 10% that isn't is the 10% that's not going to try also going after the LGBT community as hard as the Republican Party very clearly does.
I myself am trans, but you're in Ohio, so it's your state is, has more potential to matter. So it's what I'm talking about is a very personal representation of what my beliefs are, because I don't think no one should vote. I feel like people are misunderstanding what I am saying. I'm saying I personally am not voting for president. And Atomic Crouton, I know all of those things that are determined by my presidential vote. It does not matter for where I live. It's so blue that it would, the county I live, the city I live, it's something that my vote literally does not matter. Statistically, anything, my vote for president does not matter. So I do not feel like I have to, and I do not feel like I will accept browbeating over my decision, because I don't think I am doing anything wrong because of the situation I'm in.
To silently and personally make the choice is something that I want to understand more, but what I find slightly more concerning is that it seems like you are a content creator and you speak to people and people admire you and listen to you. And if you express...
I haven't made a video in 4 years.
Oh, sorry. My mistake. Oh, I have a ghost in my room. I'll have to leave.
Sure, be back in a second. This theme, I suppose, I guess, but because this is, I think, the comment that you referred to a moment ago, Sonia, right, about voting being something that is like holds weight even beyond the election and stuff, right? I want to move the conversation away from you specifically, Sonia, because I worry that we're hinging too much on your own stuff. I want to I suppose the worry for a lot of people is voting, does voting make us complicit? Like, if we vote for like a party that is involved in bad things, does that make us complicit in those bad things? I think is a worry that a lot of people feel going into the election, because people have voted based on their pragmatism, but also people vote because of their beliefs, right? A lot of people will be going into this election thinking, if I vote for the Democrats, I am voting for a party that is engaging in genocide at home, overseas, in many bad things, and therefore I am responsible for those things as well. I think this argument, whilst in some cases is true, I think there's some, to me, that doesn't, like that's just, it sounds very similar in some ways to the quite right-wing argument you hear about capitalism at large. Like when, for instance, people say, and obviously it's not quite the same degree, but like when people say like, oh, you use this phone, therefore you support workers dying, or you wear that shirt, therefore you support the actions of corporations in like Bangladesh to engage in it. And so I think that as I said earlier, like the current network for which elections take place through, the current mechanism for which they take place through, ensure that power is concentrated in these parties and ensure that people have to vote for their rights and for their well-being through the powers of those things. And so I suppose what Fiera is, I guess, hinting at with her point, and this is open for everyone. This isn't. This is an idea to consider, is like pragmatism, I guess, in the face of unjust systems and continuing on even as we know these systems are bad because of the potential repercussions. Though again, I will stress that this. I feel like at the moment the conversation seems quite fixated on you, Sonia. That is. I want to hopefully broaden beyond just Sonia to like a wider point.
Yeah. So let's see. Oh, I tried a point and I just lost it. Yeah, I feel like I can deal with the Democrats more than I can deal with the Republicans. Like when it comes to a lot of situations, that's why I'm still, like I said, I'm gonna vote for the way I'm voting, is because I feel like when it comes down to it, I feel like we can at least work with the Democrats a little better than we can with the Republicans, because the Republicans just won't work with anyone at this point. And they've made that clear for the past 20 years. They don't give a damn about anyone that's not Republican. Even when they're Republican, they don't give a damn.
Exactly, right? There's more to me, like, for as frustrating as liberal politics it is, there's not the same degree of whilst you are quite right, Sonia, they do get dragged right, they can also be dragged left, as has been seen in the past. And I know that absolutely they need to be moved much further, but to me, like, the civil rights movement is a great example, right? Like I feel it was profound that we were able, as a left-wing movement, to achieve so much from a society that had slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, the Klan, so many awful things, and yet look what was achieved. Like, and to me, that timeline is much harder to achieve if Trump wins in the election, which I suppose is what a lot of people almost see, like you said, like you said, like there's a fear that things would go the same way no matter who wins this election. But that timeline can be easier, less bad, and therefore more room, as Dargesh said, to improve things with a more or a less right-wing organizer party in charge of the country.
Yeah, because when I look throughout, like, I mean, my biggest frustration with the Dems is they don't fight hard enough when they do things. Like, they'll try to work with the Republicans instead of just sticking to their guns. But I feel like,
well, that's where an active left needs to step in. Right? And that's where there needs to be pressure. Like, I absolutely don't agree with the idea that, like, a few weeks ago when some Palestinian activists were like making were being loud at a rally or something, and there was lots of people saying, "Oh, we shouldn't be having this." Absolutely not. Make as much noise as you can. There needs to be no like especially for an act of genocide. Like, of course, you need to be making noise, but for any left wing cause needs to be at the forefront of the Democrats and any liberal party's mind, right? Otherwise, they don't get done. You don't ever achieve anything by being quiet about things. You've got to be putting pressure and noise, and absolutely there shouldn't be like, even with like with some of the memes and stuff, I find it a bit frustrating sometimes that a lot of the election is turned into a bit of a sports game where it's like, oh, and fun times with the Democrats, and it's all going to be nice and stuff. No, there's lots of serious issues that are at stake in this election. They need to be, and in the world. But for me, the election itself, the act of voting, isn't imbued with the same moral weight. For me, it's like we're engaging with the necessary tools that a capitalist was created to be able to try and survive. And whilst absolutely the parties that are in charge both have responsibility for things, for me at least, there's no moral, like, if I was in America and I voted Democrat, I would not feel that I am complicit in something that I know I oppose, and like I know I participate in protests and use my voice to raise the, as we're doing now, right, in our own small way. Being vocal against things does, it adds to societal discourse and societal discontent.
Yeah. And what I really think, I agree with some random geek. I hate the fact that DNC is silencing dissenting opinion. I really want to see them embrace it and engage in that discussion, because I feel like that is what makes them realize what the voters want. And if we can get a much bigger, like, if they listen to the voters, they'll realize, oh, this genocide is not popular amongst the voters. We need to do something about it. And the voters that it's not popular amongst are the people who voted for us. I think they really need to learn that.
Here's the thing. If the Biden-Harris deal with Israel to stop the war, to stop the genocide, goes through before the election, I will vote for Kamala Harris.
Oh, yeah, understandable.
And I think a lot of people who are, withholding their votes would vote for Kamala Harris.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they're going to intentionally withhold going forward in the discussion process until after the election in terms of the Israeli side, because they want Trump. Trump will let them do whatever they want.
Oh, yeah.
Biden and Harris are like both staunchly pro-Israel and will let them do most of what they want. But it's like, unless this like stops before comes time for election day, like I see a lot of people just not voting for Kamala Harris.
Mm-hmm.
It's a frustrating thing, right? Isn't it? Like, because like you say, you've got the American system set up to be an ally of Israel, set up to give arms and support they say themselves, like, the right of Israel to defend itself, even as that defense is openly a signal for genocide and massacres and war crimes. But at the same time, you have a leader of Israel basically all but supporting one particular candidate, the more right-wing candidate, because they will give him a mandate to do even more, right? I saw this, so Atomic Crouton says this in the chat, with the number of moderates in the US, as much as it sucks, Kamala will have to court them to win the election. We just don't have enough leftists to push her through, which I'm sort of a little bit mixed about. Go on, Sonia.
Yeah, I also disagree, because Bernie Sanders' campaign had the largest number of non-voters voting for the primary ever. If you give people a position they care about, they will vote. Kamala Harris backed off of supporting single-payer healthcare and lost her voters in the polls. She is constantly backing off positions that would gain her voters on the left, and she just does not.
And I think that's you raise a really good point, Sonia. Like, there's so many popular left-wing ideas, or not even that left-wing, actually, just like not as right-wing as what is considered normal in America, that would be massively popular. Healthcare, education, what else? Transport, LGBTQ rights. Like, there's loads of things which, because that's like for you see when Republicans go on and on about it, like, look how many trans kids there are doing this and that. Look at all these gay people. Like, that doesn't win them votes. That appeals to their fringe, awful, like terminally online, nasty far right section. But that's not a majority of American voters, or even that big a chunk. They vote, but they're not. That isn't what drives people to vote in elections ultimately. Now, I think that Atomic Crouton, there is a sort of, people are like liberal and believe in democracy and different things, but perhaps not to the extent that they're like ready here and now to denounce capitalism or whatever. But that's not because they lack they lack the vocabulary about it. So they don't lack the distaste for the system. There's a lot of discontent in the system for how it is at the moment. But if you were to ask those same people who are unhappy with both parties what they wanted, they're not necessarily going to instantly say socialism. But at the same time, as we've all sort of said, there is that appetite for change and for moving things left. However, I feel at the same time, whilst I absolutely agree with the idea that the Democrats need to stop shooting themselves in the foot and start actually moving left, like, part of the problem is of the natural problems of a capitalist system, right? Moneyed interests exist around the government and say, well, if we're going to have more democracy and more left-wing ideals, that will decrease our power to be able to influence policy, right? Like, if you're a corporation, you have an interest in keeping privatized healthcare because you're making money off it. You have an interest in higher taxation for corporations because now you have to give over more of your money to the state. So there is going to be that problem of like trying to get things sorted. But at the same time as that, there's also the difficulty in getting things moving if a far right party with an even greater incentive to crush the left, is in place. Like, part of the issue with trying to do anything is that the country, US, UK, pretty much most countries in the West, went through a phase of like a Reagan government, a Thatcher government that crushed workers' rights and crushed various abilities for the government to do things, for corporations to be scrutinized and regulated. And so any push left is going to naturally meet resistance from those things. And so at some point, there needs to be a continuous period of time where Republicans are kept out of office to be able to get the energy to actually do that in the first place. And that's very pragmatic. Like, again, I'm way to the left of the Democrat Party. My belief is that ultimately, for things to change properly, there needs to be an end to capitalism and all of that. But I'm also a pragmatist. And so if we live in a timeline that keeps this system in place for many, many years, let's hope not, because it's not going to be good for the planet. But if, let's say, in 50 years' time, we still have this system, it will have been a better time if the Republicans were out of office for as many of those years as possible than in office. And so for as much as it's really irritating that people who offer some semblance of deviation from a right-wing path, like Bernie Sanders and like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, there's still an imperative to engage with the electoral process to stop those right-wing forces from gaining that time in power, right? Like again, more sporting metaphors, every minute you're in the lead is less time for the opposition to be in the lead. Every minute you've got control of the ball is less time for the opponent to have the ball and do things with it, right? And then this, I want to hear the current information we have is a decisive return to a pre-Trump era. This is different than wanting leftist policies.
I would say that just because the current electorate, the people who normally vote, which is only half of America, the current electorate who is half of America that wants to vote for, and half of that wants to vote for Kamala Harris, which is 25% of America.
That's 75 million, right? Or 80 million.
Yeah, like about that, yeah. But like the people who don't vote want change. They want things to go leftwards, or just something better to happen in their lives. And because no one's offering it, they don't vote. It's like if you give people what they want and get people out there to tell them that this candidate is offering what they want, then they will vote. But if you give them nothing, they won't vote for you.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that touches on one of the most important elements of any election, voting. Voting rights are so abused and mistreated in America. Like the amount of disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, actively, I mean, we just saw in several swing states, Republican organizations basically booting people off the votes, the electoral roll with no, like the Democrats essentially, they tell you about it and then don't do enough to actually address that issue, right? If any of those issues had been properly sorted out over the last 4 years, it won't even matter that the Democrats aren't that brilliant, because they would have a system in place that would let people vote against Republicans and not risk still losing it anyway, right? And you're quite right too. Left-wing organization is so important, because if you give people a left-wing taste, right, like actually your healthcare could be much better. Actually, your school could do with some more funds to be able to support your kids. Actually, school lunch debt isn't the thing which should ever exist. Like, there's so many things that you could so easily get people engaged with, not even having to go and read loads of theory. Just here are some policies that could tangibly improve your life right now. And that would be enough to change. And I feel like that is something which needs to be for as important as it is to I'm terrified of a Trump presidency, but at the same time, there's things that should be at the front of Democrat policy, which could, are in some places, because I do think it is also worth stressing that some blue states do try and do these things more. Like Minnesota, for instance, has done a lot of things recently to improve the lives of its residents. That's not necessarily, obviously they're not the dream of left-wing society to live in Minnesota, but at the same time, they're to the left of what a lot of mainstream Democrats would like. They're bolder than a lot of Democrats in a lot of ways. And so as a result, their state is more livable. And I think that could be something which could be built on, right? Could be driven home for the country and made more of an issue of the country. It's maintaining that pressure on the liberals while still being able to recognize that the election is something to engage in. And I've got two slightly different comments here to spotlight again. One's from Geek. Many people would vote for Bernie, but the Dems much prefer the devil they know as opposed to the devil they don't know, which I suppose touches on that theme of, a right-wing presence in the party, right? There's a group of people with money and with a lot of financial backing who say we would rather keep things to a right-wing sort of leaning, or we don't want to necessarily swing left, either because they're terrified. I spoke to someone, I had someone on called Christiosity, a very interesting YouTuber, and she said that at the heart of the party is many people who lived through the 80s and are terrified of the years when they basically had a handful of seats versus hundreds in Republicans' court, and are terrified of losing landslide elections, and so don't ever want to risk the potential backlash of boldly swinging for left-wing or more left-leaning policies. And I think that's true, but I also think they need to grow a bit of a spine, because there is, as you've said, Sonia, and I guess you said earlier, and Fiera, there is an appetite for change. There is an appetite for actually things are not good right now. We need something radical to fix it.
Yeah, our system as it's set up does not care about the voters, really. It just benefits the people in charge. I do have to say, I do have to dip out, but this is a lot of fun. I very much appreciate the conversation, and let's hope that we can start getting this changed before it goes even more to shit.
No problem, Dargesh. You take care.
Yep. Bye.
See ya.
And then the other thing I was going to bring up was this one here. Some of the policies you mentioned cannot be accomplished on a federal level, but reside on the state level. And that's interesting, because on the one hand, there is some truth to that. But on the other hand, all the things in American society are there to be changed and are there to be able to have modification, right? There's lots of things that have changed over time. There's lots of areas that can be improved with a bit of pressure and a bit of reworking. And so that bubbling presence, if it were more vocal and vociferous in the Democrat Party, would be able to do more, I feel.
I forget what I was going to say.
That's right. Happens to me all the time. No? There was also this, which I think is the information Kamala sent out to the voters today is actually behind Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And I think that is one of the other things at the heart of one of the election discussions, fear. There's a fear, genuinely, that a lot of people have, which is that Trump's going to win, and it's going to basically transform one of the leading democracies in the world. I know it's democracies in big inverted commas, but ultimately it's a nation that is one of the most prominent in the world, lurching to the far right, has a global consequence, right? It's a huge loss for, in terms of culture, it's like a cultural moment. The far right win, and they've got a mandate all of a sudden to do lots and lots of bad things. And in the same way that the rise of America had a big impact on culture in terms of film and media, sports, language, there's that worry that a far right period in this country, or I say far right, a period in which we have a sudden change from the sort of muddling along of capitalism to outright fascism is very, very scary. And so, to touch on what was said with Fiera earlier, there is a distinguishing between the two things in that it's sharper. In the same way that someone who has an illness is ill regardless of what's going on around them, but if they are suddenly attacked, they will still feel the consequence of that attack. And I feel like that's a similar analogy. The illness is capitalism, but fascism is so much more. It is so much of a difference. And whilst one is still bad, the other is right there on the doorstep and needs to be opposed in any way we can.
I really hope someone goes and finds more Republican congressmen's ball games, baseball games. That's a joke for anyone watching. I was totally not referencing the time that guy, the Steve Scalise, got shot. I was joking.
Sports is another one, actually, right? It's that's another area that's quite interesting, because I say sports, green areas to play on, green areas, the environment. One of the big concerns that often isn't really, because like you say, right, a lot of the election coverage focuses on quite right-wing terms of immigration and all this and the economy and who can manage capitalism better and all of that sort of thing. We lose sight sometimes of the devastating consequences to the environment that just is basically being ignored because of the lack of capacity for change in a lot of places. We have a system which relies on the free market, right? And because the free market is dominated by people who have vested interest in maintaining their profits, there's not enough being done to offset the carbon emissions and change our energy sources from non-renewable sources and stop the bulldozing of forests and natural areas for car parks and police training facilities and all of that. And there's another major issue that people unify on, despite the noise that right-wing people make on it. Actually, most people want a Green Deal and environmental change and real tangible things to be done now beyond paper straws at McDonald's or
I'm burnt out.
Oh no, you're right, Sonia.
It's just I don't know. I feel like I have contributed as much as I can to the conversation, and I'm just bottoming out on terms of how much I can really contribute anymore.
Okay, well, if you don't, I mean, every word you say is a contribution. But if you feel that you're getting tired or you want to pause it, that's fine. Then, but no, I think it's we got gone, Fiera.
Oh, you've been very patient with us, Sonia. Thank you so much. I'm sure that these were not a bunch of easy questions for us to be asking you and probing you about such a personal issue. And I appreciate you answering the questions. I was hoping to ask you one more if you have the spoons for it, but I wouldn't dare to pressure you into it if you don't.
Go ahead. I'll answer.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand more of why you are choosing the way that you are choosing, because I'm in basically the exact same situation. I'm a California voter. So I do think my trying to understand more than like Dargesh in the state that they're in, at least we're in a more similar position. With the idea of choosing between a 100% Hitler or a 90% Hitler, this feels a bit like it could be drawn a parallel between the trolley problem, but we have a trolley problem that goes on many times. We get lots of levers. We have a lever now, we have another lever in 4 years, and another lever in 4 years. And keeping all of those future levers in mind, if I know that with every lever I pull, I get 10% of a better result, I know that eventually it's going to get me where I want to be, even if it means making a bunch of really shitty choices in the meantime. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then why still choose to essentially, it sounds like you're not saying I'm not going to choose to not pull the lever. It seems like you're more saying let the other person choose, because I know that both choices suck, so I don't want to be the one to have to make the choice.
Yeah, well, there are 2 levers, and one drives the trolley off a cliff while one crashes through 40 people and kills them. It's like, but the trolley has 300 or 300 people on it, so it's like, you have to like choose which is important, but like at the same time, when you pull that lever, you are making that active choice, where if like you are not, you don't make the choice, you're not inherently complicit.
But you're not also in the same breath, while you're not inherently complicit, you would also not inherently be trying to stop it, I think.
This is where like the metaphor gets a little disconnected, because I have like worked on trying to stop these sorts of things, and it's just like when one of the major issues I've spent like a lot of my life fighting for is just ignored by both candidates. At that point, like, why make the active choice and damn my conscience with the fact that I voted for Kamala Harris when I know she's going to win my state anyways? And instead, I could just sit out the presidential election, and none of the results would change, and I'd just feel.
So, if I may, in your favor, it sounds like you use your spoons in a lot of very valuable ways for a lot of marginalized communities that really need the help, and you are active and you do things. And in this one case, this choice hurts you in a way that would drain too many of your spoons and perhaps make you less useful for other communities that you are helpful for. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay, then I am all for it, and thank you for letting me, kind of probe you. I'm sorry that it was uncomfortable. I do really appreciate it, though.
Yeah, it's okay. I appreciate the conversation we had. But I gotta go. Sorry about that.
That's all right, Sonia. I mean, we're coming up to the 90-minute mark anyway, so I feel like that's a nice round number to have with the stream. I'll have to speak with Soul Bunny another time. I'm sure they, I'm sure life getting away, right? Like there's more to life than appearing on Owen McDonald's stream. But it's important to have these conversations. I do firmly believe it's a useful way of looking at the sociological world and thinking about a major issue of this time. I'm very fortunate that everyone was here to be able to speak about it. So thanks everyone for listening. Be sure to have a look at Sonia's content and go and find Fiera and Dargesh and Soul Bunny as well, because they're fantastic too. And we'll see you all next time. Take care all.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah. You